You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And we're going to continue our inside look at the Roman Catholic Church, world politics, and the extraordinary relationship between the United States and the Holy See. What role does the United States play in world history? Well, the Bible tells us. It's the second beast of Revelation chapter 13, and it serves the first beast, and it causes the whole world to worship the first beast. Who was the first beast? The papacy, the Roman Catholic Church. This book is written by a former U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. His name was Francis Rooney. The title of his book again, is The Global Vatican. You wonder who's going to be the head of this global religion? Why, the Global Vatican. And that's what's revealed in this book. If anyone is in doubt as to who the Antichrist is, there should be no doubt after reading and understanding this book. And I'll do my best to read it and to explain it and to fill in the blanks. There are many blanks in this book. And you'll notice from what is missing from this book that the author is doing his best to cover the history of the papacy, to cloak the history of the papacy. And he's a devout Roman Catholic. In his heart of hearts, he believes, obviously, that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. That for there to be a kingdom of Christ on this earth, it must have a Pope, and he must rule over the kings of the earth. He must rule over heaven and hell and the earth. After all, he does wear the tiara, the triple crown, doesn't he? He calls himself the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God, which is the very definition of Antichrist. I have it in my heart to pray for this man, Francis Rooney. He's done his homework. If he would just read his Bible, he would see that the man that he served is the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist of the Bible. And he would come out of that church, and he would join me in protest against the Antichrist. We concluded on the second from the last paragraph on page 8 yesterday. Excuse me, and we'll pick up where we left off. Still talking about the Revolutionary War and what role the Carrolls played, what role the Jesuits played, what role John Carroll, the Jesuit priest and the first bishop of the Roman Catholic Church in the colonial period, possibly the most celebrated Catholic in American history. The celebration of which was even the focus of Pope Benedict XVI's visit to the United States in May of 2008. Now, you probably didn't know this, but Pope Benedict XVI came to this country in May of 2008 to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the making of the first bishop to the Roman Catholic Church in America. John Carroll, the Jesuit priest. They didn't make much ado about that in the mainstream media. That's why you don't know anything about it. But that was his stated purpose for coming to the country. One of the principal reasons was to celebrate the first bishopric, John Carroll, of the United States of America. But this is how it all started. The American Revolution was initially a mixed blessing for Roman Catholics living in the colonies. On the positive side, all the talk of liberty raised the promise of new freedoms, including freedom of religion. That is, freedom to practice Catholicism. That's what it meant to John Carroll. That's what it meant to Charles Carroll. That's what it meant to many of the quote-unquote founding fathers. Freedom of religion for Roman Catholics, who prior to the Revolution had been suppressed. It was illegal to practice Roman Catholicism. Popery was, well, the greatest of evils to be feared. So what was the Revolutionary War all about? It was all about religion. It was all about Roman Catholicism, separating the colonies from Protestant Great Britain. The colonies were overwhelmingly Protestant. Catholicism was suppressed. If there was any hope for an American Roman Catholic Church, if there was any hope for the Pope to rule over the king of this country, well, there had to be Catholics living in the land. And they had to grow in strength and power and control in Washington, D.C. And they had to, by law, make us Catholic. To fashion the civil laws after Roman Catholic canon law. That's how you make a nation Catholic, with or without their consent. And that's exactly the history of the United States. And it began here. The struggle for religious liberty in the United States was not a struggle to make religious liberty for Protestants. It was to make religious liberty for Catholics, liberty to practice Catholicism. He said, one auspicious sign, Charles Carroll, though still unable to vote, attended the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. And I ended yesterday's broadcast by asking the question, how is it that the greatest of evils to be feared, Roman Catholicism, first citizen, a Jesuit-trained Charles Carroll of Carrollton, was allowed to attend the Continental Congress in Philadelphia when he wasn't even allowed to vote in his own colony, Maryland? There's some extraordinary influence going on here. There's no other way to explain how Charles Carroll was allowed to participate in the Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774, were there not some underhanded dealings going on? Who was there at the First Continental Congress to protest the representative of the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist of the Bible, the papacy, the representative of the Pope at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in a almost completely Protestant land? Somebody's got to scratch their head and say, what is going on? All right? The fact that Marylanders were apparently putting their faith in a Catholic was a step in the right direction, says the author. But along with anti-British sentiment came, ironically, a new wave of anti-Catholicism. See, some people, true to their Protestant faith, knowing that Britain was Protestant and that the colonies were rebelling against Protestantism, instead of protesting the rebellion, protesting the revolution, tried to remind the overwhelmingly Protestant population at the time the history of the Roman Catholic Church, the biblical identity of the Antichrist, the papacy. Protestants were still protesting. And they stirred up a new wave of anti-Catholicism, anti-popery, anti-Christ, if you will. There was still an urgent warning from many wise, biblically wise, and historically wise colonists that Rome was the greatest of evils to be feared in this new land. He says this was generated mainly by the Quebec Act, passed by Parliament in the summer of 1774. Remember I told you yesterday, the book that I read here on Inquisition Update some years ago, called The Ark and the Dove, admits that Charles Carroll boarded ship, left the Chesapeake Bay, and went to England, and spent a great deal of time in England, but didn't bother to tell us what he did there. Well, I surmise logic dictates, common sense demands that Charles Carroll, the first citizen, the most powerful and influential Roman Catholic in the colonies at the time, the instrument of the papacy, the age-old, he came from a family that had distinguished itself and made itself filthy rich by being mercenaries for the Pope. His whole history was marked as crusaders for the Pope, conquering lands for the Pope, Ireland being just one. And this Charles Carroll, allowed to participate in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, 1774. I'll tell you what he did when he was in England. He was together with the Jesuits. He was together with leading Freemasons in Parliament, and they together hatched a plan that would foment a revolution and separate the colonies from Protestant Great Britain. Intolerable acts, they called them. Excessive taxes. Taxation without representation. And the Quebec Act, which just gobbled up the whole Ohio River Valley, a vast portion of this new land, so-called, and just gave it to Canada. Land that obviously belonged to this new nation. Now, look, if somebody was going to lop off 3 or 4 states in your area and give it to Canada, you'd begin to wonder what in the dickens is going on, right? Well, you might even be ready to, mount up and lock and load, right? Well, that's what it was intended to do. And it had the cooperation of the Parliament in Britain, which is supposed to be Protestant. Don't you think they knew that the vast majority of the colonists were Protestant? And here they do that which is just inexplicable. Abuse of these Protestants in this new land, giving their land away to Roman Catholic Canada, guaranteeing the right of Canadians to be Roman Catholic and practice their religion in Canada. A lot going on here that simple logic doesn't explain unless you understand the mission that is America, the Jesuit mission called America, and the lengths to which they will go to accomplish their mission. And Charles Carroll was Jesuit educated. He knew who his allies were in the British Parliament. He knew the Jesuits were going to foment this Revolutionary War, and he was going to help on our side of the fence, right in our own land. Now do you get a concept of the phrase, the greatest of evils to be feared? And yet Charles Carroll was a Roman Catholic and revered in this country. First citizen. Wealthy, powerful, influential, a member of the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Somebody needs to look into this. The intolerable acts that led to the revolution were hatched by Jesuits and Freemasons who were influential in the British Parliament. And it was all for the purpose to ensure that the colonies would separate from England and that Roman Catholicism would be free. Sounds like a Jesuit mission, doesn't it? It was very successful. It says this was generated mainly by the Quebec Act passed by Parliament in the summer of 1774. The Quebec Act, usually lumped among the intolerable acts as they are called, was a blatant attempt by the British Parliament, supposedly Protestant, the British Parliament to seek support from the Canadian provinces. They wanted help from the Canadians. But the Canadians are Catholic. Montreal is Catholic. The official religion, as it were, in the government of Canada is Catholic, Roman Catholic. It says, recognizing that much of settled Canada was still French-speaking and very much Catholic, as it had been under French dominion. The British offered the Canadians the right and freedom to practice their faith, provided they profess allegiance to King George. So you got England, supposedly Protestant, making deals with Roman Catholic Canada. We're going to let you practice Catholicism. We're going to make Canada Catholic. All you got to do is pledge allegiance to the king. We're going to even take off a huge bite out of the West, out of the Ohio River Valley. We're going to give it to Canada. Okay? What do you think the colonists thought of that? The King of England, supposedly Protestants, lopping off this huge bite of land and giving it to French Catholic Canada? Say, something doesn't make sense here. Something's going on. It says the act also included a provision to hand over frontier territory to Quebec's Catholics, land that many Americans believed was rightfully theirs and which would eventually become part of the United States. That's the Quebec Act. Just giving over vast tracts of land to the French Canadians, the French Catholic Canadians. Now, the response to the Quebec Act in the colonies was outrage, as one might imagine. Anti-British rhetoric now blended with long-simmering fears of popery. All right, already they're afraid the Pope is in control of the British Parliament. The Pope is in control of the King of England. I mean, after all, he's given all this Protestant land to Roman Catholic Canada. And they're imposing upon us unfair taxes, on and on and on. You know, Charles Carroll had to be sitting at his desk in his fancy, beautiful mansion, the most exquisite mansion in the colonies at the time, sitting at his desk in his office just licking his chops. It's all coming together. In October of 1774, the Continental Congress, in an address written by John Jay, later the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, issued dire warnings of a conspiracy between the English monarchy and the Roman Catholic Church, citing the Church's propensity for, quote, impiety, bigotry, persecution, murder, and rebellion, unquote, Jay insinuated that the Pope intended to help Britain enslave Americans. John Jay insinuated that the Pope intended to help Britain enslave Americans. Jay was hardly alone among the quote-unquote founders in promoting anti-Catholicism. Even so fair-minded a man as John Adams scorned Catholics as, quote, poor wretches fingering their beads, in reference to the rosary, obviously, as he wrote home to his wife Abigail after attending a mass in Philadelphia the same October that John Jay issued his address. So, in response to the suspicion that the greatest of all evils to be feared, the Pope, was in cahoots with the Parliament in Great Britain, anti-Catholicism sprang up. Just as some anti-Catholicism, not much, but a little anti-Catholicism beginning to spring up now, because some of us begin to suspect the Pope is involved in what's going on in this country and the world. The New World Order is papal, okay? It's not the corporations. I'm sorry. The corporations are being used to help, but the top of this new pyramid in the New World Order is Satan's vicar, the vicar of Satan on earth, the papacy. You know, sometimes I sit here and I'm thinking, people are listening to me talking and probably thinking I'm overstating. Would it be an overstatement if you remembered the hundreds of millions that the papacy has slain over the last 2 millennia? God-fearing, Bible-believing Christians burned at the stake, emasculated, run through with spears, impaled upon stakes, stretched on the rack, starved to death in dungeons, waterboarded. Have you ever seen the instruments of torture used by Rome over the last 2 millennia? I've got a book that was given to me as a gift from a Protestant showing high-gloss photographs of those instruments of torture. Thumb screws, knee screws, a mechanism called the Virgin Mary, where they would put you inside and then close the door and impale you with innumerable spikes. How many hundreds of millions had their eyes gouged out? How many were fed to dogs? How many of their children were disgraced in front of their parents, and their parents disgraced in front of their children? How many houses burned? How many churches burned? How many inquisitions? How many crusades? And history cannot account for the horror that has been the Roman Catholic Church to God's people. Would I sound like I'm overstating things if you had a concept of how many poor, suffering followers of Jesus have died at the hands of the Antichrist over the last 2 millennia? Would you still think me a radical fundamentalist? Would you still think me a Bible-thumping extremist? Or a realist? The history of the Roman Catholic Church is dripping with the blood of the saints and the martyrs of Jesus. And we've forgotten them. And we forgot who slew them. And he did it in the name of God and thought he was doing God's service. and he's still doing it today. We'll be back right after these messages.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Introducing the most efficient gravity filter available. You know, if you were to throw 100 ball bearings at a magnet, most would bounce off. But if you placed them on the magnet, all would stick. The same principle applies in water filtration. Most filtration systems force water through the filter at 60 to 90 psi, causing water molecules to race through the filter in less than a second. The Berkey light is different. Water molecules take minutes to pass through the torturous path of the self-sterilizing filters. This allows the proprietary media formulation to remove and reduce pathogenic bacteria, cysts, chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, organic solvents, foul tastes, odors, heavy metals, and nitrates. It is so powerful it purifies raw, untreated water from remote lakes, streams, and stagnant ponds.
Get the advanced Berkey Light Purifier by calling First Amendment Radio at 559-781-3773 or order on the web at FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Not yet available in Iowa.
Welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update. We'll continue where we left off before the break. John Jay was hardly alone among the founders in promoting anti-Catholicism. Even so fair-minded a man as John Adams scorned Catholics as, quote, poor wretches fingering their beads, unquote, as he wrote home to his wife Abigail after attending a mass in Philadelphia the same October that John Jay issued his address. In the immediate wake of the Quebec Act, Adams encouraged Protestant preachers to use their pulpits to inflame feeling against the Catholic Church. His Boston cousin, the rabble-rousing Sam Adams, went even further, denouncing popery as, quote, the greatest of evils to be feared, unquote. The title of this chapter, the first chapter in Francis Rooney's book, The Global Vatican. Sam Adams said it was the greatest of evils to be feared, Roman Catholicism, popery. But then, quite abruptly, the attitudes of Americans began to shift. One important indication of the new direction was an order issued by General George Washington to the Continental Army on November 5th, 1775, in anticipation of an annual holiday known as Pope's Day. Pope's Day. Have you ever heard of it? It was called Pope's Day in the colonies, but it was called Guy Fawkes Day in England. And it denounced the papacy and the Jesuits who plotted to blow up the British Parliament while it was in session. 36 kegs of dynamite found in the basement of the British Parliament in 1605, and the conspirators were tried. The Roman Catholic Church was found to be complicit. The Jesuits organized it, and it's part of history. The gunpowder plot of 1605. You think Rome would stop at anything in order to get control of Great Britain after attempting to blow up the entire... Have you ever seen that building? Huge. And they attempted to blow it up. 36 kegs of dynamite, gunpowder in the basement. And the providence of God ended the plot before it could be accomplished. Great Britain was to be Protestant. So were the colonies. But General George Washington, believed by many to be a Protestant, thought it repugnant for American soldiers to observe Pope's Day, Guy Fawkes Day. He said, marking a Catholic plot to blow up the House of Parliament in 1605, the holiday called Guy Fawkes Day in England, after its most infamous conspirator, was traditionally celebrated in America by burning the Pope in effigy. That's right, they would build this little Pope and burn him. Is that, I mean, it's just gross, but is it gross in light of what the Pope tried to do to the British Parliament? What the popes tried to do to Protestantism? All right, so it wouldn't be tolerated today. George Washington wouldn't tolerate it either. He said General Washington condemned, quote, that ridiculous and childish custom, unquote, as he put it, quote, so monstrous as not to be suffered or excused, unquote. Now, General George Washington has to lead a rebellion against Protestant Great Britain. And he's got to do it with the help and support of Charles Carroll, because Charles Carroll's going to finance the thing. Charles Carroll is going to finance the thing. And if he allows this Pope's Day to continue to be celebrated among the troops, Catholics aren't going to fight. And Charles Carroll just might withdraw his financial support for the revolution. Whose side is George Washington on? I'll let others argue the point, but General George Washington stopped this practice of celebrating Pope's Day or Guy Fawkes Day in England. You see, there were Protestants, Protestants, overwhelmingly Protestant soldiers in the military going to rebel against Protestant Great Britain, but they haven't forgotten. They haven't forgotten the role that the Pope played in trying to overthrow the British government. And to keep the memory alive, the threat, the greatest of evils to be feared in the colonies, the Pope, they celebrated Pope's Day, burnt the Pope in effigy. Remember the martyrs of Jesus. Remember the Protestants that died at the hands of the popes even before Protestantism was cool. Remember the Waldenses. Remember the Albigenses. Remember all the saints for the last, at that time, 1,500 years. Don't ever forget. The Vatican, the papacy, claims to be the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and wherever Protestantism exists, the papacy will try to destroy it, and no one is more handy at that mission than the Jesuits, who fomented the gunpowder plot to overthrow the British Parliament with 36 kegs of gunpowder in the basement. Don't ever forget. But Washington stopped the practice. After all, he had to lead this rebellion. He needed the support of the Catholic Church. He needed the support of Charles and John Carroll. Protestantism was eventually going to have to yield to Roman Catholicism. And it couldn't happen without George Washington. Washington was moved by his real sense of decency, says the author, but he was also being pragmatic. Just a year after the Quebec Act, the Patriots had come to realize that they needed the French Canadians on their side. Roman Catholic French Canada, right? Burning popes in effigy was not going to win friends in Roman Catholic Quebec. Regretting earlier outbursts, the Continental Congress decided to send a special committee of ambassadors on a diplomatic mission to Montreal to make amends and try to lead their northern neighbors to the colonial cause. They didn't want Canada to fight on the side of the British. They wanted French Catholic Canada to fight on the side of the colonies. Are you getting the picture? The Congress named, and I will add the words, French Freemason Benjamin Franklin to lead this committee. All right? If you believe what I say, that the Jesuits were in control of high-ranking Freemasons in the colonies, and that the Jesuits were using the Freemasons to help foment this discord between Protestant England and the colonies, Benjamin Franklin was number one. Okay? A diabolical man. If you've ever read any of the unauthorized history of Benjamin Franklin, you realize he served no God from heaven. Now, Franklin would be accompanied by two other delegates to Congress, the Marylanders, Samuel Chase and Charles Carroll. Give me a break, right? Though Franklin brought his prestige and fame to the mission, Charles Carroll, Jesuit-trained, devout Roman Catholic, warrior for the Pope, Charles Carroll was the indispensable man. Why was he indispensable? Because he's financing the whole war. With money from God only knows, the Jesuits, the Vatican. Now, it says not only would he be religiously agreeable to the French Roman Catholic Canadians, but he also spoke fluent French. How did he come about to speak French? Well, he got his education at St. Omer's in Flanders, France. John Adams, who had so recently dismissed Catholics as, quote, simple and ignorant, unquote, had to admit that Charles Carroll was neither, okay? Was neither simple nor ignorant. No, he was Jesuit trained. He knew where this whole war was going to go. It was his war. He had to admit that Charles Carroll was neither ignorant nor simple. In a letter to Abigail dated February 1776, Adams described Carroll as a man, quote, of great abilities and learning, unquote, as well as a, quote, zealous supporter of the rights of America, in whose cause he has hazarded his all, unquote. what's Charles Carroll's cause? Not liberty for you and me. Liberty for Roman Catholics in an overwhelmingly Protestant colony. Now, before sending the expedition off to Canada, Congress also resolved that Charles Carroll would ask his cousin, do tell, Father John Carroll, to accompany the group. So you got Benjamin Franklin bringing all the prestige, who was a diabolical, Luciferian, satanic worshiping, Jesuit warrior, Freemason. Okay? Big time French Freemason. A Jesuit under another name, if that's what you want to call it. Okay? That's what I call it. Freemasonry, when somebody mentions Freemasonry, I see behind all the Freemasons Jesuits lined up. The Freemasons are just simply, a multiplying agent for the Jesuits. Most Freemasons don't have a clue what Freemasonry is really all about. But they don't have to know. See, they're compartmentalized. They just do what they're told. They just assemble their little component of the bomb and have no idea what it's ultimately going to produce. They swear secret oaths. They hold secret proceedings, never understanding what they're all about. They're just cadavers being used to build something, a new world order. The Jesuits are the ones who write the oaths and write the rituals and condemn these men to a life of service to Antichrist. Freemasonry is just Jesuitism under another name. You've got a Freemason and you've got Jesuit Charles Carroll and Jesuit John Carroll going to French Canadian Catholic country for the Continental Congress of all things. Now, like Charles, John spoke fluent French and Latin. Okay, in addition to France, he spoke Latin. Why? Because he was Jesuit trained. I mean, that's how they speak. They speak in Latin so nobody else can understand what they're saying. He's Roman Catholic. Latin is the language of the priest. He's a Jesuit priest. So while he's in Canada, if he wants to say something to another Roman Catholic Jesuit trained Catholic Canadian, he can speak in Latin. Nobody can understand what he's saying. See the double dealing going on here? Like Charles, John spoke fluent French and Latin, which would be useful, he says. You bet it's useful if you can speak a language nobody else but a Jesuit can understand. Nor would it hurt that he was a Catholic priest. John Carroll appreciated the, quote, distinguished and unexpected honor, yuck, yuck, of the invitation, but he had doubts about the chances of the mission's success and his own credentials as a diplomat. Let me tell you something. When you spend 27 years, 27 consecutive years under intense Jesuit training, can you imagine going to college for 27 years? When John Carroll graduated from that 27-year education, you can bet your bippy he was more than qualified to be a diplomat. Diplomacy is, well, one of the sharpest knives in the Jesuit drawer. Diplomacy. That's how they manipulate the world. Diplomacy. It's an art of war. I told you the Jesuits are the greatest practitioners of Sun Tzu's art of war of any other group in the world. Diplomacy is one of their most secret weapons. And here John Carroll is flattered for this unexpected invitation. About as unexpected as Santa Claus on Christmas, right? Right? Despite his hesitation, he agreed to go. It's like being late for your own party, right? He says the four Americans, let me correct this. The four papists departed from Philadelphia in the early spring of 1776 to commence an arduous journey north overland to New York, then along the Hudson River to Albany, and across Lake Champlain to Montreal. The orders they carried from Congress instructed them to promise the Canadians that if they cooperated, that is, if they helped the colonists fight to separate from Protestant Great Britain, the Americans would treat them as equals and leave Catholics alone to practice as they chose. Americans would treat them as equals and leave Catholics alone to practice as they chose. In other words, they promised to be equal with the Church of Antichrist. Is that what the overwhelmingly Protestant Continental Congress of 1776 interested in? Being equals with the Church of Antichrist? Is that what God wants of his people? For us to be equal with Antichrist? And to accept Roman Catholics as equal? You know, I once thought that ecumenism was a new word. It's not new at all. This is ecumenism right here in the First Continental Congress. The unity of all Christians to the Roman Catholic Church. We're all equals. Just as Christ is equal with Satan, right? Wrong. Wrong. Ecumenism is rebellion against Christ. I choose to separate the holy from the profane. I will not sit at table with one from the Church of Antichrist. I will not negotiate with Jesuits or popes. Touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, says Christ. You see what a critical error it is to recognize Roman Catholicism as just another part of Christianity? It's not Christian at all. You don't want to be equal with Satan or his vicar. Now, the Continental Congress, overwhelmingly Protestant, obviously, has just launched a Catholic mission to Canada. Where is the protest? John Carroll's concerns turned out to be warranted. The Canadians were in no mood to help the colonists who had so recently maligned them. The committee persevered in Canada for several months, but to no avail. When Benjamin Franklin's health turned poor, John Carroll, the Jesuit, accompanied him home to Philadelphia. Quote, I find I grow daily more feeble and think I could hardly have got so far but for Mr. Carroll's friendly assistance and tender care of me, unquote, Franklin wrote in a letter along the way home. Why do you suppose John Carroll took such wonderful care of Freemason Ben Franklin? They were spiritual brethren. That's why. They were on a mission. And one of the missioners fell ill, and John Carroll took care of him. It says, by the end of the journey, the two men were close friends. I got news for you. They were closer than close friends before they ever met. They have the same father. Satan himself. Here was at least one fruit of an otherwise futile sojourn, a relationship that would have a crucial effect on Carroll's future life and the future of the American Catholic Church. There you go. You heard it from a Roman Catholic, not a Protestant. You heard it from a Roman Catholic himself. Francis Rooney, former ambassador to the Holy See. A relationship between John Carroll and Benjamin Franklin, a crucial relationship affecting Carroll's future life and the future of the American Roman Catholic Church. The mere fact that Charles and John Carroll had stuck out their necks for the American cause was evidence that their religion, whatever its perceived flaws, produced good and reliable patriots. Kind of changes your concept of the word patriotism, doesn't it? Are you a patriot to the United States? Are you so patriotic to the United States that you would unite with Jesuits and Roman Catholics to achieve a separation from Protestant Great Britain? Because that's what this is all about. You know something? I've come to realize one thing. I was born into a heavenly kingdom. I have a king. His name is Jesus, and he died for me. Shed his own blood for me. He was going to raise up a spiritual kingdom of kings and priests. We have a land. It's called the New Jerusalem and the new creation, a new heaven and a new earth. We're promised to be part of that. To as many as receive him gave he the power to become the sons of God. That's the kingdom I belong to. That's the kingdom that I'm patriotic to. Otherwise, patriotism has lost its meaning. I have no patriotism anymore for any earthly nation, because the prophet Daniel laid forth the facts of life. When Christ returns, there will not be one earthly kingdom left. They will all be destroyed. That means America, too. Not one earthly kingdom has ever brought in Christ's righteousness. Not one nation in the history of the world can call itself godly. Not one government of men that ever existed or ever will exist, including the Pope's New World Order, and especially the Pope's New World Order, will ever bring in Christ's righteousness. Righteousness will never prevail absent the bodily presence of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ himself. So my patriotism just flew right out the window for the United States. I want to be a citizen and a patriot of a kingdom that will last forever in righteousness. And let God have his way with all the failures of the earth, and especially the Pope's New World Order. That's it for me this week. We'll continue where we left off next week on the broadcast. Please pray for me. Pray for Protestants everywhere, that God will wake up their minds and their hearts and their eyes to what this New World Order really is.
Gold and silver is tremendously undervalued. Global demand vastly exceeds mine supply by more than 60% annually. There is little in the financial world more certain than a coming explosion in the prices of gold and silver. The U.S. dollar continues to lose value and respect as the world's reserve currency. Our nation faces challenges on many fronts, and a day doesn't pass without another economist bringing forth warnings of impending economic calamity. There has never been a better time than right now to acquire physical gold and silver. Discount Gold and Silver Trading was founded on the principles of truth and honesty. We believe in providing a quality product, quality service, and most importantly, competitive pricing. We provide all forms of precious metals, including American gold, silver, platinum, and rare investment and circulated coins. Silver bars, rounds, and 90% silver bags are on hand for the silver investor. Gold self-directed IRAs are available. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, that's 1-800-375-4188.
I pledge allegiance to the King of Kings and to his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. One holy nation, under Heavenly Father, grace, mercy, justice for all.
100 days, 100 subscribers at $7 will bring FirstAmendmentRadio.com to the minimum level necessary to sustain it through 2015. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com. $7 a month. Really, you can afford that for our Protestant First Amendment rights and the gospel of the kingdom message. Where your heart is, there will your treasure be also. Go to support.FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
Good day, everyone, everywhere, and special greetings to all those seated in heavenly places in Jesus, our Messiah. The name of this broadcast is Cross the Border, and I'm Nicholas, and we're continuing our trek through the Bible. We are in 1 Kings, a very interesting study. Kings, as you know, gives us the chronology that fits in part of the calendar that God gave us